Dialectic with Jamie Q. Roberts. All right, I'm speaking with Musa al-Gharbi today. He's a sociologist and assistant professor at the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University, Daniel Bell Research Fellow at the almighty Heterodox Academy. Maybe we can talk a bit more about the academy. Musa was also communications director of the Heterodox Academy from 2016 to 2020. You've written for New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic, Guardian. And his first book, we have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite, was published by Princeton University Press in 2024. That's mostly why we're here today. This is a significant figure, and forgive me for saying this, miserable culture war against woke. You know, The Godfather Part 3. It's like meant to be the bad one. I'm working through the first couple with my son at the moment. I haven't got to the third one. There's some line in it. Every time I try to get out, you pull me back in. You know that?
Yeah.
That feels like my life with this culture wars. It's just like, I'm done. And then it's like, no, you're back. No, you're back. You're in deeper. Anyway, welcome. Thank you for talking to me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
Warm-up questions. Your family has connections with the U.S. military. How's that shaped you? How's that affected your life? Shaped your thinking about things?
Yeah, I mean, So my father was in the army. My mother was in the army. My stepdad was in the army. My grandfather was on my mom's side. Fought in 3 wars: World War II, Korea, and then Vietnam. My twin brother was in the army. A lot of my half brothers and step brothers were in the army. A lot of my cousins. And so the army and the kind of military ties of my family, I guess, shaped my work in a few ways. One was that during the 2016 election, I noticed that there was a lot of confidence that among experts that Hillary Clinton was going to lose. That Trump was going to lose, that Hillary Clinton was going to win.
Sure,
And I was struck because not only were pretty much all the experts in agreement, but the agreement was really extreme. Like they were just very confident. Like Nate Silver gave Trump a 30% chance of winning, and all these experts were like, a 30%, a 1 in 3 shot? What are you, a Trump supporter? Are you out of your mind? Like, right?
I remember following Nate, that whole whatever 538.
Yeah, 5-3. Yeah. And so I was, and so one of the ways in which the military, my kind of military, the upbringing that I grew up in, was that in military intelligence communities, there's this practice called red teaming, where because lives are on the line based on whether or not a plan is sound or whether or not your understanding of the world is accurate or not, what they often do is they'll have one team draw up a plan, and then they'll have another group of folks approach that plan as a hostile actor. So people who had no role in drawing up the plan just approach it and go with the mindset, like, this is the dumbest plan that's ever made. If you do this, you're all going to die. It's going to set back U.S. policy forever. It's like the catastrophic, total crap plan. And the good thing about approaching it that way is it actually takes advantage of motivated reasoning tendencies that people have. So you kind of
you cash in on it.
As
opposed to trying to get rid of it.
And so it allows you to see the things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see. That collectively, between the plan and the red team, you can get a good sense of kind of. And so I tried to do this. As someone who studies knowledge, I was really interested in the fact that the experts were so extreme and unanimous in their understanding of what would happen in the race. And so I decided to red team the election. So I started assuming the opposite of what I wanted to happen. So I assumed that Trump would win, and then tried to look for evidence. Is there evidence that Trump would win? And I found a lot of it, a ton of it, like an insane amount of evidence that Trump was probably going to win and that Hillary Clinton was probably going to lose, or in any case was a very weak candidate. that basically no one seemed to be taking seriously. So I spent most of the 2016 cycle, mostly in vain, trying to get anyone who would listen to me to take Trump's prospects more seriously and kind of adjust accordingly. And then during that cycle, I was mostly screaming into a vacuum, and I was publishing pieces, making this case in like Salon and Huffington Post and other left outlets like that, but mostly screaming into a vacuum. And then after the election, everyone was like, "Oh, how prescient," blah blah blah. So, but the general approach to approaching the kind of predominant view as a hostile actor, kind of assuming the opposite. This is an example, this tactic to try to get leverage on contentious social issues is something that is in some ways a product of military background, military intelligence. That both of my parents were, my mom, my stepdad were military intelligence. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, that's interesting. It's kind of like the opposite of steel manning.
Yeah.
It's not even straw manning. It's like anti-steel manning, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, that's interesting. What do you think would have happened though if people would have taken the Trump threat more seriously? I mean, would it have still made a difference?
I mean, it could have made a difference in the candidates that they fielded, or even if Hillary Clinton was the nominee. Mm-hmm. God help us. Maybe she could have run the campaign a little differently. So, for instance, I mean, the 2016 race was actually kind of tight, right? So, tens of thousands of votes shifted in one direction or another, and it's a completely different race. And so, in the case of the 2016 race, for instance, Hillary Clinton was very confident that there was this blue wall in places like Michigan and
swing states
and these kind of Rust Belt states. And so she basically invested zero effort. She thought the Electoral College was a lock, and what she was really worried about was losing the popular vote. So she and her campaign dedicated a lot of time and effort to juicing turnout in places like California and New York to make sure that have a lot of population, solidly Democratic, in order to make sure that she won the popular vote. And so,
my goodness.
And so this is a case where there was actually a lot of evidence that actually she was doing pretty weak in these Rust Belt states that she was taking for granted, and that the Electoral College was not a lock. And so this is a case where if they were taking that kind of data more seriously, they might have adjusted their campaign strategy, even if you stuck with the same candidate, which, in principle, though.
Okay, yeah, I got you.
Yeah.
But yes, so you say fielding a different candidate, if Bernie had made it, say.
Mm-hmm. Or even Joe Biden. Like Joe Biden in 2016 was, he even won in 2020 as a much diminished person. He probably would have won in 2016, I think, too, because like if I try to run the counterfactual, I don't think there's any states that Hillary Clinton won that Joe Biden would have lost, but I think there are some states that Hillary Clinton lost that Joe Biden might have won, like, again, some of these kind of more working class Rust Belt areas and so on.
So it's kind of interesting, in both elections, Trump was the beneficiary of just weak candidate on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that comes through in a lot of my work, including in the book, is that when people try to understand some of these political transformations that have been going on in the United States over the last 10 years, it's less about Trump and the particular characteristics of Trump and more about growing numbers of people being alienated from the Democratic Party. And you can see that because some of the shifts actually predate Trump, and they'll probably continue after him if nothing else changes on the Democrat side.
I mean, honestly, I've felt it in myself, and obviously I'm an Australian and not voting, but from being horrified about Trump in 2016 to not being particularly interested in 2020 to being still somewhat anti-Trump up to about 3 months out from the election, and then as the election approached, and figures like Elon and Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr. kind of got involved. Just I found myself
tilting a little more
and just starting to think, honestly, if a message needs to get sent to the Democrats, and there might be various things I don't agree with Trump, but the anti-woke message is very important. So I mean, I've felt that, within myself.
The pull. Well, and it's one of the distressing things that I've been talking about for a bit now, for I guess for about 10 years now, God help me, is that almost nothing. One of the things that distressed me the most about the 2016 election is that almost nothing was learned in the aftermath. Rather than people going, oh, this is one of the largest collective prediction errors in kind of modern history, or, oh, this was a very winnable race that we somehow lost to one of the least popular candidates who's ever run in recent years. Rather than like learning anything from what Democrats went wrong, how the experts got things wrong, why people were not voting the way, like instead, academics and journalists spent almost the entire remaining subsequent years trying to pathologize the voters, trying to explain what was wrong with the voters such that they didn't vote the way they should.
I've heard it so many times. You see the map going round of it's like whatever's there's, the blue states on the edge, and then it's like dumb fuckistan in the middle.
Yeah, they're stupid, they're racist, they're sexist, they're authoritarian, all
they just needed to be explained to them.
Yeah.
I mean, the 2024 election was kind of like a rerun of 2016 on steroids with the... Yeah,
and a lot of the dynamics played out the same way, actually, in terms of the states that that shifted hands, in terms of the constituencies. You saw highly educated, relatively affluent, urban and suburban kind of white people embracing Kamala Harris very strongly, even more like she did better with whites than a lot of other. And she did fine. She didn't, her performance with whites was great. The main reason she lost was because she underperformed with non-whites and working class people and so on. And so, like, you see these same tendencies that we saw in 2016, we saw again in 2024.
Sure. Okay. Let me have a look at my vast list of questions here. As I was looking over your bio, the 2014 article, how much moral high ground does the US have over ISIS? Sounds like the kind of critique I would have made back then as well. And I find myself thinking, and yet you've kind of moved into this heterodox space. And I guess the question I want to ask is, are your views now pretty much the same as your views then when you wrote the article, or has your journey through this kind of heterodox, critical of symbolic capitalist space, has that led to your views shifting?
One of the things, so there's a few things that are, one thing that's important to note is that writers don't pick their headlines, right? So I think a lot of people really glommed onto the headline, and if you look at the substance of the article, so this was an article that ultimately led to me getting, indirectly, eventually led to me getting canceled by Fox News, targeted by Fox News, and I lost an academic job. Originally, it began over a discussion around an actual academic article I wrote in a journal on Twitter, and then I embarrassed this dude on Twitter, so he started taking bits and pieces of my essays out of context and trying to. And so this was the essay, though, in part because of the headline that, especially like Fox News and other people were like really. So one of the things that's interesting, though, when I read that article today, is there are definitely ways in which the world has evolved, in which my own thinking has evolved. But one of the things I'm actually more struck by than anything is that the actual argument that I make in that piece is that America has a lot of problems here, and we should be worrying about those instead of stirring up a bunch of crap in other countries, that most of these foreign interventions we're doing in other countries don't work anyway, even relative to their stated goals. They create harm instead. If this article had come out 1 year later, there's this quote that there's that the only thing that's worse than being too late is being too early. Like if this article had come out 1 year later, it would have been actually interpreted as almost like a left MAGA article. Totally. Places like Fox News would not have would not have received it in the same way, because this is actually the argument that Donald Trump was making.
I know, right? Well, that's what's so interesting. This feels like the last moment where maybe this is overstating, but this feels like the last moment when you could get cancelled by the right. In that kind of way. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you can still get cancelled by the right, but it sort of felt like, a year or two later, Trump was, the anti-war candidate, whereas Hillary was more of the hawk.
The hawk.
The Libya intervention hawk. And so, so suddenly, it's... but this is sort of part of, I don't know, it's a question I was going to ask later, but maybe now, like this... as well jump into it, whether there's like a, you got to go where it goes, but whether there is a sort of a political realignment, which you yourself are a part of.
Yeah.
Or whether that's overstating it. Maybe that's what people who swing to the right as they get older, bullshit themselves about to make themselves feel better about being more conservative or something.
So there is some research that shows that when people get older, and especially when it seems like, especially when they get married and have kids, but even just when you get older and you start acquiring property and having more responsibilities and things like that, in general, yeah, people do tend to get more conservative as they enter a different life space, in part because they have more at stake, right? Like, for instance, it's really easy to talk about taking things from other people and redistributing them and making radical social changes and all of this when you don't have any investment in this one. But then as it becomes your stuff that's going to get taken and reallocated by some person who's straight out of high school, or when it's your children who are going to be paying the cost of this, whatever this grand social experiment is, and so on, then it hits different, right? And so but I think, and so I guess you and I both over the, time only marches one way. So, so we're both older, and we're both at a different stage in our life than we were at the beginning of this culture war journey. That's probably not irrelevant, but at the same time, there is, looking at a whole bunch of data, you can see that there's actually this, that there is an actual set of political realignments underway. And in the U.S., you can see that there is there's kind of two trends that interacted at once to kind of produce the outcome we saw in 2024. First, there was this kind of longer story, about a 50-year story of working class people becoming increasingly mistrustful of the Democrats, and the Democrats being increasingly disdainful towards working class people. So after Nixon won, basically, the Democrats, a lot of Democratic leadership decided that the white working class was a lost cause, and that what they wanted to do was kind of create a coalition of that the professionals were where the action is. So they wanted to create a coalition basically of white professionals and poor people, and they thought that would be a coalition that could take them. The problem was they did succeed because the messages, the cultural messages they were sending, basically your votes are not welcome, we don't care about you, forget you, you're irrelevant, like this kind of messaging that the Democratic Party started sending after '68 was processed and received by the white voters, so by the white working class voters. They did lose those voters as they intended, but the problem was they actually didn't gain the voters from, especially a lot of the professionals, continued to vote Republican for economic reasons. So the Democratic Party was kind of left in the wilderness for there's a quarter century where the Democrats only held the White House
Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, and it was only because it was right after Nixon got
Watergate.
Scandalized out of office. Other than that, total Republican dominance for a quarter century. They just didn't have a coalition. Bill Clinton changed the game there a little bit. He was able to actually bring. He reoriented the Democratic Party's platform and strategy, messaging, and all of that in a way that did appeal to knowledge economy professionals. In fact, they were a lot of talk. He was this kind of wonkish guy who surrounded himself with the wonkiest of the wonks, and they were all these young, highly educated, Columbia, Harvard kind of people, and so he was our kind of guy, But he managed to actually pull professionals into the party, as they had been dreaming about for a couple decades, without losing the minority vote. This was a coalition that actually worked pretty well up through 2010. But then it started falling apart as the Great Awakening took off. A lot of the kind of working class minority voters and poor people and so on actually grew alienated from the Democratic Party and increasingly left. You can see this consistent trends after 2010. So again, predating Trump, will probably continue after him. You can see this in every midterm and general election since 2010, growing alienation. And so again, the Democrats find themselves in a place where they don't really have a workable coalition. You can't actually, it's tough to actually be a viable national party if your main base is just symbolic capitalists, knowledge economy professionals, in part because we tend to be consolidated in an increasingly small number of cities and states in places that Democrats already control. So
the Electoral College is already in the bag.
The Electoral College is looking, more and more grim for Democrats until
I mean, they've already got it in like California or whatever, so it doesn't really help that you. You win the state by even more.
Yeah, if you win the state 60-40, or if you win the state by 70-30, it's the same amount of Electoral College votes. So you can rack up your popular vote numbers, right, by like Hillary Clinton tried to do, by kind of juicing turnout in these kind of highly blue states, but it doesn't do anything for you in the Senate. It doesn't do anything for you in the Electoral College. And then, in fact, when you look at where people are moving, a lot of people are moving away from these knowledge economy hubs into states that are red, like Sunbelt states and stuff like this, because they're more livable in various ways. And so if these trends don't change, when they do congressional redistricting, even in the House of Representatives, actually, the Democrats are probably going to find themselves in a tougher space. They probably need to rethink their coalition again. There will have to be, so you do see this political realignment, this kind of broader alienation of working class, especially white working class voters and rural voters. The urban-rural divide really kicked off in the 90s with Clinton when he reoriented the party around symbolic capitalists. A lot of people in small towns, rural areas, and so on started moving away. So you see these white working class voters, rural voters, small town voters moving away before 2010, and then after 2010, you start seeing, even in urban and suburban areas, non-white working class and less affluent voters moving away from the Democratic Party too.
It's all right. It's in like a guilty way. It makes me feel a little better for feeling, a little bit of that Trump pull,
Yeah,
you're
not alone.
You're like, maybe the Democrats, because I mean, I'm someone who's been on the left my whole adult life. Now I'm less sure after my various university adventures and just feeling like this sort of shifting alignment. That the Democrats don't really feel like the party of the workers, or it's a line call or something.
One of my colleagues, two of my colleagues, Stephanie Moravchik and John Shields, they have this book called Trump's Democrats, where they look at there are a number of districts in America that have only gone Democratic for like literally 40 years. That hasn't been a Republican that's won that did flip in 2016 or 2020, depending on the race. And so, I mean, it's astonishing. Like there is a realignment among constituencies that have long been Democrat, and even in places that Democrats really thought have been a wall. And you can see this realignment again. Just to double click on this point, the main driver of this realignment actually isn't that the GOP, that the Republican Party suddenly has some new, sexy, compelling message that they've somehow pulled the wool over people's eyes and they're kind of misleading. Like any story that you want to tell that attributes these trends to some unique characteristics of Trump or the messaging of the Republican Party and things like that is actually missing where the action is. What I can see in the data is that the biggest driver is actually the Democratic Party is alienating a lot of people. Now it helps, and it actually did help probably a bit that Trump, for instance, had a position on things like Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security and things like that, where he's like, we're not going to cut them. That defied the Republican orthodoxy, and it probably did help that.
Sure.
Even though Republicans are typically hawks, running against a hawkish Democrat, he took a more dovish position. That probably did help. So there are things like that probably helped. But it seems like the main driver is actually that the Democratic Party is just turning people off and has been increasingly alienating them for decades now.
I mean that's kind of been my own journey on the left as well. It's like, as I said, being on the left my adult life, and the more I try to talk about issues and ask questions or whatever, and you keep, coming up against a wall or hostility, I feel like more and more it's like, what am I even doing here? Maybe just rather be unhomed or something like that. I'll linger here a little bit more. The whole thing of populism always fascinates me, because populists, the virtuous people versus the corrupt elites. And it's not very far from that to, a classic kind of Marxist view. I mean, they're so similar. And yet, when I hear it taught at university here, there's disdain for the people who we refer to as populists. It's like, okay, you've got real grievances, but you're confused. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't have a program. You're just tricked. And I think often about the song, you probably know it, the Oliver Anthony, Rich Men North of Richmond.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Which was like this epic populist anthem. And, he just says he's a middle of the road guy. But then, maybe I'm going too deep here. Billy Bragg. I'm taking a punt here. He's like a British political songwriter.
Maybe.
All right.
Say more.
All right, look, I'm in too deep now. I got to push on. But anyway, so Oliver Anthony's got this epic populist anthem, but there's a whole lot of signaling in there as well, which shows that it's not like a sort of a classic left thing. He complains about obese people. He says Lord all the time, so there's all these little sort of signals. Billy Bragg writes a response song called Rich Men Earning North of $1 Million, and he takes Oliver Anthony to task about, complaining about overweight people on government benefits. And he says, the main thing you need to do is, all working people are the same. You need to join a union. And that's kind of like the refrain. But it feels to me like there's just something fundamental in the populist mindset. It's like, no, we're not joining the union. There's a certain like populist character that's, they're getting screwed over by the man. They're angry, but there's something proud or something. I can't put my finger on it, but yeah, it's just, I wonder if you can talk to that tension between sort of populism and more traditional like Marxist type thinking.
I mean, there is in a lot of, especially areas like where Oliver was living and stuff, in a lot of these kinds of contexts, there is this emphasis on individualism, on not individualism understood as like a selfish focus on me. Yeah, in fact, that's actually more common in places like here. People are more likely to kind of, but individualism as in the sense of whatever problems I'm having, it's up to me to try to figure it out.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, but that's sad. I think one of the things that's really interesting right now is that when you look at unions, there is this kind of interesting change happening where increasingly symbolic capitalists, so people who work in fields like education and media and stuff, are unionizing at significantly higher rates than they did in the past. But
yeah, I mean, it's huge. It's huge here in the uni.
Yeah, but kind of traditional workers, people who provide physical goods and services to people, they're actually unionizing less and less.
Is that because they're being tricked? Sorry to interrupt, but are they being like just tricked by the capitalists? That's the standard argument. Is that they don't even know what their interests are. This is like beguiled by the great ogre Trump or something like that.
No, I mean, so what you can see, one of the things that's driving the change that you can see in some of the data, asking people who left unions or who didn't join unions, why didn't you join, and so on, is this growing perception that unions are not focused on. So if someone joins, if a normal worker, you can see this kind of difference between symbolic capitalists and normal workers in a few ways. Symbolic capitalists tend to care a lot about what their employer's politics are. Like they want to know what their employer thinks and feels about moral and political issues. They want their employer to be front and forward and aligned with them, even to the point where they're likely to, they're sometimes they'll even quit a job because their employer doesn't align with them on moral and political issues. Okay, this is not how normie workers tend. There's all sorts of research on this. Most workers in America, they don't know their employer's perspectives on moral and political issues. They don't want to know their employer's perspectives on moral and political issues. They don't want their employers weighing into contentious moral and political topics. They want to do their jobs, get paid, and go home. Like they are there to do, right? They're not there as some kind of giant self-actualization project of like, and they don't need their employer to validate their, And you can see this difference as well and this matters, this difference matters if we want to understand some of the trends in unionization. So when you look at the polling and surveys of workers who aren't part of unions or who've left unions, they say they're too political. And by too political, they mean they're too focused on kind of contentious moral and political issues that are unrelated.
Stuff or whatever,
People join unions because they want higher pay, more stable working conditions, better benefits, things, job security, things like this. This is why most workers join unions. It's not because they want to engage in any other kind of moral and political cause. They want to improve their work situation in very concrete, tangible, practical ways. That's why they join unions. But we've seen this shift in unions where it used to be the case that the people who run unions were people who kind of started on the shop floor and they worked their way up within the union and eventually kind of quit their day job sometimes and just became like union administrators, but they had a kind of connection to the people who were running the shop. They knew the challenges that those people faced. They had lines of connection from having worked for many years at the and things like this. That's not the case anymore. Increasingly, unions are hiring people straight out of straight out of college to administer the unions, people who have never had a real job, who don't share the same sensibilities and priorities as most normie workers. They share the sensibilities and priorities of symbolic capitalists. And so for a lot of these folks who just graduated college and they're taking an administration job in a union, the same way they might at Wells Fargo or somewhere like that. To them, some of the most urgent needs of the union is to make sure the union has the right statement about George Floyd, or to make sure that the union is kind of throwing its money behind LGBTQ issues and things like this. And again, like this is just not. And so to the extent that this kind of stuff becomes the focus of the union, and of union statements and of union activity and of union political donations to political candidates and things like this, then it makes the unions more appealing to people like symbolic capitalists and less appealing to normie workers. And so you can actually explain both of these trends that we're seeing, the decrease in unionization and by this kind of more fundamental divide in terms of how different groups think about politics, the kinds of things they care about why they join unions in the first place, what they expect out of their employers, and so on. Yep.
So yeah, this just looks more like really good evidence for the realignment and the, I don't know, for want of a better word, the corruption of the left by identity issues over the last decade or more.
One big limitation that we'll have to see how it plays out, or one reason, I guess, if I were going to phrase it a slightly different way, why all hope is not lost for Democrats in the short to medium term would be there is this problem where on the Republican side, a lot of people are alienated by the Democrats, but one thing that we often see in these periods of awakening, as I show in the book, is like backlash. So a backlash against us, against symbolic capitalists. So what often happens is, even under ordinary times, people who are symbolic capitalists, as I mentioned, we think about politics in funky ways. We engage in politics in ways that seem weird and bizarre to most other people. During these periods of great awakening, the gaps between us and other people grow a lot bigger because we shift a lot while most other people just kind of stay on the same track they were on. And not only do the gaps grow bigger, but people care about the gaps more because of how we're conducting ourselves. So we become a lot more militant about mocking, harassing, shaming, censoring anyone who disagrees with us, even for views that we adopted 10 minutes ago. So like 10 minutes ago, we decided that all the prisons need to be abolished. And if you disagree with me for this view that I adopted 10 minutes ago, I'm going to call you a racist. So this kind of tendency causes people to notice the gap between us and them more and to care about it more. And this creates an opportunity for political entrepreneurs, usually on the right, to kind of campaign on bringing people like us under control. Now, the problem for the right-aligned political parties in the medium to long term is that sometimes the right-aligned parties take the wrong message from the fact that so a lot of voters are frustrated with the Democrats' focus on this kind of culture war stuff, so they've been voting Republican. Well, what some of the Republican, especially the right-leaning symbolic capitalists, often take from it is that, oh wow, there must be this really big appetite out there for even more culture war stuff. What they really want, like they don't take from it the correct message, which is that most normie people would rather focus on bread and butter issues instead of culture war stuff. They take from it, oh,
more culture
in
war,
fact, what they want is right-leaning culture wars. We need to, there's this real appetite out there for a whole bunch of right-leaning culture wars, and so they lean into the culture wars even more, just from the other direction.
And fighting the culture wars from the right is not a good thing. It might be necessary for a period, but it's not the thing you want to be focusing on. Doing the whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is one of the reasons why anti-wokenings or whatever, this kind of period of blowback, why it often also doesn't persist forever, is because oftentimes the response on the right is also miscalibrated. What people really want is people focused on kitchen sink, bread and butter. What especially non-symbolic capitalists, better said, really want are people focused on bread and butter, kitchen sink,
it's the economy,
practical issues. Exactly.
The old cliche.
But they often have a hard time actually getting that voting for either party, either of the two big parties. And so you get a little bit of oscillation instead. Yep.
Great. Let's talk a bit more about all the woke stuff. I guess so. It was a good sort of opening political discussion. When I ponder all of this, I take a sort of a similar approach to you. I sort of go back and say, well, is this new, or is it just versions of what's gone before? And I go back and I look at Monty Python's Holy Grail or Life of Brian. I'm like, they were fighting narrow-mindedness, closed thing, whatever you want to call it, like from the Christian right, but also the socialist left. And I'm like, wow, it looks remarkably similar. And you go back to Orwell. You mentioned Orwell a fair bit in your book. It's like, well, that's kind of similar. Yeah. And then I go back further. I'm like, Nietzsche seemed to be pissed off about this in some way as well. And I go back further. Lewis Carroll. So I'm a bit of a literature philosophy guy. Like Lewis Carroll was fighting it. And you go back. I feel like Shakespeare was fighting. Plato was fighting it. It seems like versions of this sort of similar battle just arise again and again. But yeah, you tracked 4 awakenings or something, and you just see it as a cycle. But get to my question. What does interest me is the sense that you get maybe from the anti-wokes, the intellectual dark web types that I've written about. They're far more leaning into we're in a period of decadence and serious civilization decline that we're not going to pull out of. As someone like Peterson will talk about, the attack on merit and competence, truth is absolutely, it's striking at the heart of our, liberal civilization. And so, those people see it. It's not just like this sort of periodic thing that just comes and goes, but as, no, this is pretty end game.
Yeah.
So I'm wary of catastrophizing, but at the same time, I've been seeing truth and whatnot, merit being undermined in the university for as long as I've been here, since the mid-90s. So to me, I see it as getting worse and on a bit of a downward trajectory, not just cycles. You want to talk to that a little bit more?
Sure. So I think, so I'll kind of argue for both positions. So
Dialectic.
I'll start by arguing by trying to make a case against the idea that there's kind of a. So one of the things that I've stressed in some of my writings is that for some of these things that people notice, like the fact that a lot of academic work is bad, like bad, really bad, crappy, useless. One of the things that's striking, though, is that this has kind of always been the case. So like Weber in his vocation lectures in Science as a Vocation, he talks about this, about how like most of what academics produce is like trivial, wrong. Even the stuff that's impactful and right will probably be overturned and supplanted. If you can manage to produce even one thing that people actually talk about even a little bit after you're dead, like you've already accomplished more than pretty much any academic ever accomplishes. And so like we have this story because there's this kind of survivorship bias sometimes where we have these really impactful works that have survived and we think this is how most work was back then, when it's just not the case. It's always been the case that And in fact, even when you look at some of the best work of these previous eras that was really impactful, if you evaluate it from the standpoint of today's standards of science, some of it actually wouldn't even be published today because it's not rigorous enough. So like they didn't control for a lot of things. They didn't measure things as accurately as they could. Things like this. Now I think some of that rigor is kind of leads to this kind of weird, like we're kind of fetishize that in a way that actually prevents us from like answering some big questions and tackling some big questions and making progress on big problems. I think, if anything, maybe the pendulum swung in the other direction. But it is the case that in terms of things like that in many respects, fields like psychology and so on are actually far more rigorous today, despite the replication crisis. I mean, again, like if you look at some of the at a lot of those papers from the 60s and 70s, they're also not replicating, and the ones that
the fact that there is a crisis is in some ways a good thing.
Yeah, they're recognizing the problem and they're trying to make progress on it. And so I think we have to keep two things in the mind at the same time. That it's true that there's a lot of crap, insane amounts of crap. We can probably do with less slop. We can find ways to make it less sloppy. We shouldn't just be like overly blasé about slop. But there's this great.
There was plenty of slop before, and we made it through.
Yeah, and there's this great essay by this guy Adam Mastroianni called "Science is a Strong Link Problem," and what he argues is that, kind of taken from Weber, is that it's always been the case that most science is wrong and trivial and whatever. Mm-hmm. That doesn't matter. It's fine actually if most stuff is slop. He argues. Because what the reason science is valuable, the reason science matters, is that even though most of what's produced is slop and it's not impactful and it doesn't stand and so on over time, there's a small number of things that do survive and hold up and make a huge impact, that transform how we do society, that transforms people's lives and lifestyles. And so the big challenge, he argues, for science isn't how do we prevent any of the slop from getting published? Let's gatekeep the slop out of existence, but rather, how can we create the conditions to make sure that the truly game-changing stuff is actually able to get published and pass through and survive? Because sometimes when you over gatekeep, you can kill the important stuff too.
Sure. So you're better off. I mean, I think I made the same argument even in the introduction to my book, that it's actually okay letting a whole lot of, you letting a whole lot of stuff through, because the main thing is you don't want to miss the true positives. You don't want to call them what is it, false negatives? I don't know, something like that. Yeah. That's the bigger loss, would be to kill some of these truly transformative, important, game-changing ideas in the name of keeping out of preventing something from being published that's not going to have an impact anyway, right? So the point though is don't worry too much about academia.
Yeah, well, and the same thing I would say about some of the discussions about merit. So it's definitely the case that a lot of institutions have had these kind of weird, borderline illegal or outright illegal hiring practices that are now getting revoked and canceled and all of this kind of stuff. And I think that's healthy. I think it's healthy to revoke, especially a lot of these that are like blatantly illegal and stuff like this. But that said, it is important to contextualize what hiring was like before the rise of DEI. So before the rise of DEI stuff, like it wasn't until the 90s actually. Up until the 1990s, faculty didn't even have to, departments didn't even have to publicly list jobs. They would just give lifetime appointments to people in their networks. Yeah, with no competition, meritocratic or otherwise. They just gave jobs to people in their networks oftentimes. And a lot of these jobs in the symbolic professions, the book talks about at length, actually were kind of created as sinecures for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and people who were not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were literally excluded from the professions. And so it's only when we stop taking for granted, so in that case, if you were openly gay, you could get fired. If you were not a woman, if you were not a man or white, or if you were a Jewish person, you would get excluded and so on. In that context, it was probably the case that no one talked about race or gender and stuff in hiring committees, because what was there to talk about? The hiring pool was only, but that doesn't mean that hiring was not identity based then. It was more identity based. You had to belong to, right?
Okay,
So it was only when we stopped taking for granted that these positions belong to straight white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men that this question of, well, who does get to be part of these professions and on what basis, that even becomes a live question. And when you look at hiring and promotion today, it's more metrics focused than it's ever been. It's more competitive than ever, like in a sick to an unhealthy, frankly, not like I think it's too, but it's more competitive than ever. It's more standardized and transparent than it's ever been. In fact, part of the reason we're able to expose some of this illegal crap is because it's more transparent than it's been in the past, right?
So there's like a very bad period, then we passed through something of a reasonable meritocratic period, and now we're in a touch of an overcorrection, but the overcorrection's not nearly as bad as where we came from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important for people to kind of keep a longer arc when they're and so that's the case for the maybe it's not the end of the world situation. Now, if I were going to make a case the other direction, I think that one of the things that is striking, so there's a lot of commonalities, as I show in the book, between these cycles, but actually. And in retrospect, I actually wish I spent a little more time in the book talking about this. One thing that is a little different from cycle to cycle is that across these cycles, like if you look at how destabilizing these periods of awakening are, I think there is a ratcheting effect probably happening where, so if you have this period of intense contestation around these kind of moral and cultural issues, but it involves, say, 3% of workers who are distributed kind of pretty broadly across society. So they're kind of spread out, and they don't have a lot of, they have significant influence over society, but not a ton, as was the case in the 1920s during the first awakening.
Okay, yeah.
Symbolic capitalists were about 3% of workers. They were distributed kind of, okay. So fast forward to the 2020s, where now symbolic capitalists are a third of workers, so 10 times as many, consolidated in a small number of an increasingly small number of hubs. So they're concentrated together with these kind of
the media, universities, entertainment.
Yeah, and then you have these interconnected networks of like nonprofit sphere, entertainment, media, academia, and so on. These kind of interconnected networks on top of it. So in that kind of a context, when you have some highly, and just in general, we have a lot more influence over society, we have a lot more wealth in our hands than ever before. And so in that kind of a context, if you have some highly destabilizing event that involves a third of workers, then these highly, and these kind of tightly concentrated hubs and stuff, the destabilizing effect that can have on systems and
cyclical, but this one's a bigger one.
Yeah, I guess what you would expect, I guess, is that they keep getting bigger and big, like the wave would look kind of wider and wider over time.
The amplitude.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just thinking about various things. I don't know. When I was reading your book, I was thinking of The Big Lebowski. You ever get into that movie? Yeah.
Why does everything got to be a travesty with you, man?
Yeah. But you know what? That was funny. That came out in like 97 or something, and it was making fun of the political correctness in 91, and it was just like. You know, Tarantino's talked about this as well, that, you know, in the 80s, there was like it was kind of like political correctness light. So it was interesting that you noted that in your book as well. It was like a little 5-year one. And then South Park as well, obviously deals with all of this. I remember when we were kicking off around 2014 or 15 with this latest cycle, there's a couple of old guys sitting leaning on the fence saying, you know, how long did the last one last? You know, and they go, I think that was about 7 years, you know. They go, well, we got a ways to go, but you know.
Yeah.
So when I was reading your book, I was thinking about all of these references to earlier awakenings.
Yeah.
But this one's kicking on. I mean, we're surely we're 10 or 11 years in.
And so what I show in some of my work, I talk about it a little bit in the book, but on my website I have this essay called "The Great Awakening is Winding Down," and what you can see looking at the metrics in the U.S. at least is that. Starting after 2021, there does seem to be a peak, and most of the indicators you want to look at, like how people answer poll and survey questions, the distribution of protest activity, corporate posture and statements on entertainment outputs, academic outputs, media outputs, by cancel culture incidents from the left, by any number of these kind of metrics. You see that 2021 seems to be a peak for most of this stuff, and it's on the now we're not living in 2009 yet, right? But the downtrend is clear. In fact, we're closer to it. Like by most of those metrics, we're somewhere around 2015 or so. So significantly away. But yeah. So there does there does seem to be a we're past the peak, at least in the U.S. Of this particular cycle. It plays out a little differently on slightly different timescales in other countries. So
I wonder
Australia,
I wonder if I mean I'm immersed in American culture for better or worse, but I often wonder whether we're just behind or something. Couple of years, 3 or 4, I don't know.
That's possible. I'm working on an essay on my Substack that kind of takes that question on more, because this book is mostly focused on the U.S. to keep it manageable, but there is some work by others in the UK, in France, and so on that show that there's, like, for instance, some of these political realignments. You see them in other countries as well. Like in the UK, Labour is increasingly based in cities like London. Like their strength is in cities like London, where the large symbolic hubs. And among highly affluent, relatively affluent, highly educated professionals and so on, and people who are more distant from the symbolic professions, both communities and stakeholders that are more distant, have been moving towards the Tories. You can see this in the UK.
Or the Reform.
Or
like
Reform.
A whole new party.
Yeah, or Reform, absolutely.
Like anti-establishment.
Yeah, and you can see similar trends in France. You can see similar trends in other countries. And so there are ways in which there are echoes, but my colleague in New Zealand, actually, David Rosado, I co-authored some paper with him where we were looking at trends in media discourse in the U.S.
I mentioned it in my book.
Oh, okay.
So yeah.
So he has
those interesting rise in the word use.
Yeah. So he has a sequel paper he did where he looks at different countries to see. To see kind of what the awakening trend looks like in different. And this is one of the things he finds, is that there is significant differences across from country to country in kind of peer countries as far as when they kick off, when they die down, and so on. And so, and so I have an argument about kind of why you would expect to see that variation and kind of what that variation might look like. But I'm probably going to put an article on my Substack in the next couple of days on that, delving into it more. But in any event, it probably is the case that Australia is maybe a little bit.
I ponder Australia because we've got the sort of usual Conservative Party. We've got a Labor Party which is reasonably closely tied to the unions still, which is interesting. Then we have a Greens Party, which has traditionally been more the urban symbolic capitalists, whereas the Labor Party still keeps its roots a bit. And then we've got this new phenomenon here, which is very interesting. They call them teal candidates, which are independents.
Oh, okay.
But they tend to be, they are like eastern suburbs, so the most affluent areas, and they just look like the quintessential symbolic capitalists. They have a lot of money. They come from the most wealthy areas, yet they talk loudly about environmentalism and things like that, and they're winning seats. And so it's this phenomenon's been going for 4, 5, 6 years now, and that's very interesting because they're not exactly the Greens, they're not Labor. They're this sort of interesting whole new class of people, the symbolic capitalists.
Yeah.
So it's worth studying it from that perspective. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Anyway. So we've talked a lot about, I suppose, the woke stuff and whatnot. Maybe let's how long have we been going, by the way? Just to break the fourth wall. 55? Cool to go on a bit more?
Sure.
Let's try to do some big questions, philosophize a bit more. I love the big questions.
Yeah.
You wrote in your book, I love that you wrote it, that when you get into like some of us get into academia or whatever because you want to do big questions. And I'm like, that's totally me. It's just like, oh, I can't stand the narrow focus. It drives me crazy. I'm not a scholar. I'm like,
Yeah.
And so, I like that you're into that and you had to go at that yourself. Just looking at my big questions here. I guess I'll just dive straight in. I wrote the damn things. I often think, like, what am I meant to be doing other than pursuing the true, the good, and the beautiful? Like, I can't think of a better response.
Yeah.
You know, like, if I'm going to be a symbolic capitalist or whatever the heck I am here at the uni, I've ended up working here. What's my duty? All I can think of is the classic response, the true, the good, and the beautiful, to the best of my ability. Yeah. Okay, I'm getting quite well remunerated, so I should offer some decent bang for my buck, hopefully, to the students, whatever. I mean, what do you think? What should we do? I mean, we're not exactly going to be going away. I mean, we could quit our jobs, I suppose, but if we are going to be working here, what do we serve? What do we try to do?
Yeah, so hopefully we're not going away in the U.S. though. But we do have this problem. We have this problem where large and growing numbers of people in society don't think that we're holding up our end of the deal. So like a lot of the benefits that we take for granted, if you look at symbolic capitalists, we have a lot more autonomy than most people. In the academy, I can choose what I get to study, what I want to study. Other than the time I'm literally in the classroom, I have a lot of time, a lot of discretion in how I structure my time. Am I going to grade right now? Am I going to do lessons plans now? Am I going to do research now? Am I going to sit and stare at the ceiling now? I have a lot of discretion in terms of
start a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Start a podcast now. We can do basically whatever we want. And as far as we get, as you said, we get paid a lot more than most people. We have a lot more social prestige. But these things weren't just given to us as academics because we're just special people. There was a kind of social contract that was implicit, and that's actually encoded in documents like the AAUP. They have their documents that enshrine tenure protections for academics and so on. They explicitly describe a social contract there. They say that the reason that we're endowed with these benefits from society is to enable us to better pursue the truth and advance projects that help the common good.
True and the good.
And they say to the extent that, but critically, these rights that we have, they do come with duties, and our freedoms come with obligations, and our rights come with responsibilities. And if we aren't holding up our end of the deal, if growing numbers of the public feel like we're not upholding our rights, engaging in a responsible way, and so on, then they're going to come for our rights and our freedoms and our privileges, and they should. That's what the AAUP documents stress, that they should. It would actually be appropriate for them to come for our rights and our freedoms and so on. And one of the things that I get disturbed by a little bit as a scholar, especially as a scholar who works at a land-grant public university, so I'm literally a civil servant. So in addition to my research interests, pursuing the true and the good and all of this, I have a distinct public mission here. I'm also here to educate students and to help them understand the discipline, to help sharpen their thinking, to help them pursue whatever life paths that they're interested in, and so on. I have this important pedagogy is an important part. It's the thing that pays the bills. It's the reason why most voters are while voters support research and so on. If it wasn't for pedagogy, a lot of our departments wouldn't exist. If you ask normie Americans, should we fund research, just pure research on things like physics, they would say sure. But if you ask them, should we fund pure research on the humanities or even the social sciences, right? That's a more dicey proposition. The reason that our fields exist in many respects is because of the pedagogical mission. Now, a lot of my colleagues at research universities don't hold teaching in high esteem, and teaching is not really held as a high priority at research universities.
Interesting.
And more importantly, a lot of my colleagues who are civil servants, who are paid by tax dollars to provide a public good, often demonstrate a kind of willful disdain towards the very public they're supposed to be serving. I think if you're going to be a public servant, it actually is incumbent on you to give a care, at least a little bit, about kind of what the constituents you're serving think and feel, what their concerns and priorities are, and to in some way speak to those. You don't have to be slavish about conforming to whatever public opinion is, but you should. People should have a sense that the universities represent people like them, that they serve their interests and needs and speak to their values and concerns in some way, shape, and form. And if they don't feel that way, then it's not unreasonable for them to ask, well, then why in the flip are we funding these things, right?
The unis do speak to some people. I mean, the woke students are happy, more or less, but they are the minority, is my sense, that there's a sort of quietish majority who aren't really on board, but they don't speak up much.
Yeah, I mean, this has been my experience in general, is that for a lot of these institutions, I think they're actually a lot less extreme than they appear to people from the outside. People like Nassim Nicholas Taleb and others have shown that sometimes you can have a minority as small as 5% that can just totally dominate an institution.
That's my feeling. Somewhere between 5 and 20, maybe, depending on the day.
Yeah, I would say, it's probably closer to 10, 20, somewhere there.
Yeah, I think it's higher than 5, but it's not super high.
But the point is the way that they can dominate, you can have this kind of unrepresentative minority dominating an institution as if the minority is highly organized and intolerant, and they're surrounded by other people who are disorganized, who are much less organized, who are much less militant about kind of, and who are, and especially if the other people are sympathetic. So like in the case of anti-racism, for instance, a lot of the stuff that's being pushed in the name of anti-racism, there's a lot of academics who think a lot of that stuff is bad, crappy, unhelpful, illiberal in some cases, whatever. But they're also sympathetic to the cause of anti-racism, and they certainly don't want to be
still
seen
from
as,
the left.
Like they're concerned about racism. They're concerned about racialized inequalities that persist and so on. They're not against the cause of anti-racism, and they certainly don't want to be seen as being opposed to anti-racism, because if you're anti-racism, then what does that make you?
Racist.
Yeah, exactly. And so in this kind of a context where you have a lot of people who are sympathetic or in any event don't want to be seen as being opposed, then it can be really easy for an unrepresentative minority to just run racket over the institution. And you can see this. I think in a lot of these institutions, this is the thing I stress in the book, is they're probably a lot less extreme than they appear to many people to be from the outside. Because you do have this kind of unrepresentative minorities that can institutionally dominate, that do dominate.
But it is unbelievably hard to fight against. I mean, I've been here at Sydney Uni for 4 or 5 years, and almost every course I'll try to talk about. I always try to frame it in different ways, but often I call it like Enlightenment values versus postmodern values. But it's really hard, because when you come up against something like critical theory, any claim that you make about how the world is, the postmodernists or the critical theorists would say, oh, well, you would say that. You're construing the world that way to suit your interests. So like, no matter what I say can then be said, well, no, you're not talking about reality. You're just exerting your power. And it's an unbelievably brilliant technique. And so you can't really argue out of it, because it's post-reason. And so all I can ever do is talk about these things and appeal to, I don't know, some kind of innate humanity in the students, where they still actually care about reasoning and evidence. But they're not easy arguments to win.
Well, in some ways, I think part of the reason why this book has had some of the impact it's had is because what it does actually is take some of these arguments by, say, critical race theory, or post-colonial theory, or queer theory, or feminist standpoint epistemology, and so on, these literatures, takes the arguments from those literatures, which I view as to what I view as the logical conclusion, which should lead proponents of those views to ask themselves, if this is the way ideologies function in general, why should we think that the ostensibly emancipatory ideologies that we subscribe to are somehow unique from how ideologies function in general? If this is the people in general tend to behave in these in these ways, and we're people, why should we think that the ways that we're behaving are very different from? So what this book does in some senses is again, is it takes the arguments from these literatures and it applies them reflexively. I think this is part of why even a lot of readers on the left have been able to read the book, and it's been able to kind of land with them in a way that a lot of other critiques might not, is because it's not a view from the outside trying to challenge these, trying to kind of, that starts from a place of rejecting the premise, but instead it actually says, it runs with the premise. It's like an argument internal to the argument that's already on the table, saying, okay, well, if these are the premises that we're running with, then let's really run with them. As Weber put it, the materialist analysis isn't some streetcar that you just that you get on when it's kind of convenient for your argument, and then get off when it starts to approach your stop. Like if you want to make this kind of argument, take it all the way. So I think, but I think you're absolutely right that if you're trying to attack it from the outside, it's challenging, especially if you don't have the right kind of what I call totemic capital, if you don't belong to the right identity groups to where. So one of the other contradictions of this book, in some ways, is that it is, to some extent, it's a physical embodiment. I can actually touch some of the contradictions the book describes. I can, because, so for instance, the book criticizes the tendency of relying on credentials, especially credentials from elite institutions like Columbia, to decide which voices are worth listening to, whose perspectives we should be taking seriously. But, I published this book with Princeton University Press, and I went out of my way to target Princeton University Press because I understood that it would change how the book is received.
Sure.
And they were looking, the reason they were interested in me is because I was coming from Columbia. If I had sent the same manuscript as a graduate student from University of North Dakota, probably wouldn't have gotten the same read, right? And then similarly, the book criticizes the way a lot of elites leverage these collective identities, like Black, queer, and so on, in the service of their own individual benefit. So they profit themselves without helping other people by leveraging these collective identities. But it's also the case, so the book criticizes that tendency, but it's also the case that part of the reason that Princeton was interested in publishing this book is because I'm Black. Now, it's not the case that they just give Princeton books to all the Blacks, like everyone who's Black just gets a Princeton book, but it is the case that if I had written this exact same book as a cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, neurotypical white man, and especially if I had any hint, God help me, of conservatism or evangelical Christianity or something like that about me, the book would have been, probably wouldn't have been published, would have been perceived as being too risky, too challenging, too something, too offensive, whatever. If it was published, it probably would have had sensitivity readers and all this other stuff placed on it, and the reception to it probably would have been very different. Part of the reason I have the ironically, even though the book is criticizing this very tendency, part of the reason I have the ability to just go pew, pew, pew and say whatever I think is because I'm a Black Muslim dude who writes for The Guardian and so on, right? So I think, if you're trying to, I don't envy the position of trying to argue against a lot of these things without having the same kind of totemic resources at your disposal. Yeah,
it's interesting because one of the things years ago when I was getting into the whole intellectual dark web space was the idea that the left needs to get its own house in order because you come at it from outside and it doesn't work. But, I've considered myself as someone from the left trying to get my own house in order. But, basically, I'm just on the right now, for having done that, it's exactly what you're talking about. You just become like a conservative fascist or something like that. And you're like, didn't see that coming. Or maybe I did. I don't know. But it is interesting. What allows what allows us to speak and say things. And
last thing I'll say real quick on this bigger question.
Sure.
Because it's kind of related. One of the things that I've been disturbed by a lot is that if you look at higher ed, like most workers in America, they don't have any protections at all in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of association. Not even the First Amendment applies in the United States to private workplaces.
Okay.
In places like higher ed, we have a really robust set of protections. When you go to court in the United States on free speech grounds, you almost always win. As David French said, being a First Amendment lawyer in the United States is beautiful. It's mostly you just show up to court, you collect your win, you collect your paycheck, and you go to the next case. They overwhelmingly win. So academics in the United States have more academic freedom than they have more freedom than any other workers in the United States, more freedom than comparable academics in most other countries, and more freedom than they have in the past. In fact, formally, freedoms in the United States for academics and other knowledge economy workers have been growing, not shrinking. They've actually been growing in terms of our formal freedoms. Now, that said, when you look at tendencies for self-censorship and things like this, despite the fact that we have more freedom than most workers, we're also much, much, much more likely to self-censor and to censor other people. And in that regard, we're becoming even more and more averse to speaking our minds over time.
It's the same here, same vibe.
Yeah, and so even though the freedoms are large and expanding, the expressive atmosphere is small and shrinking. And this is something that I find genuinely disturbing, and I think it's in part because of the selection criteria we increasingly use in higher ed. It's increasingly, especially elite schools, want people who have these kind of sterling records, who maximize their standardized test scores and so on. But the thing about it is so if you look at how does someone get into a school like Harvard, the people who get into Harvard tend to be people who showed up every day and on time to school. They completed their assignments in accordance with what their teachers wanted, and went above and beyond. And they were really concerned about the opinions of adults and tried to ingratiate themselves. And they got nice letters of recommendation from the adults in their lives who they ingratiated themselves to. And they had no disciplinary problems, but they did the right kinds of extracurricular activities.
Sounds terrible.
And so the kind of people that these elite schools typically select for today are people who are highly capable. They are capable, intellectually capable, highly capable, very conscientious. So they get the work done. They get it done on time and according to standard, right? But conformist. But they're conformists.
That's the issue, the conformity.
And so so we're selecting for these folks, and then the longer you stay in these institutions, the more that way you become. In fact, one of the things that's really disturbing to me as it relates to things like tenure, in principle, tenure was created as a way of encouraging academics to do really big, risky projects.
It's meant to push you in the crazy direction.
Yes,
in
push
a good
the boundaries.
sense.
Yeah, do kind of really ambitious things that are challenging, things that might piss people off and have them come
It's the signal noise thing from before.
Yes.
We want some bold stuff, even if
we're
it's
trying
wrong.
tenure is supposed to free people up to make those kind of big, kind of. Instead, though, if you look at how the tenure system actually operates in the United States, what often ends up happening is this carrot of tenure leads people to the advice you get when you're an early career scholar is that if you want an academic job, and then if you want to get tenure when you become an academic, then what you need to do is you need to do safe conventional projects, and you need to keep your head down and put your tail between your legs and don't rock the boat, don't do anything contentious, don't make any enemies, so on and so forth.
But once you've been selling out for too long, it becomes you.
Absolutely. This is the big problem, is that if you've spent 4 years in undergrad, 6 years in your PhD program, 6 more years on the tenure track, so 2 decades just about, with your head down and your tail between your legs, by the time that they take the cuffs off and they go, okay, you're free to pew, pew, pew.
Go crazy now.
Yeah, you're no longer a guy who goes crazy. You're a guy who keeps your head down and your tail between your legs.
But you maybe never were in the
and just
first
stay
place because you jumped through all those hoops anyway.
Absolutely, if you were willing to. And so, and then you'll also advise your own students, because it works for you. Your own students, you'll tell them the same thing. Keep your head down, keep your tail between your legs, and so on. And what you don't see often in that story, when for instance, I was getting that advice, what my professors didn't ever tell me, but that I did notice, thank God, was that there are all sorts of other people who took that advice. They kept their head down, their tail between their legs, and they betrayed themselves for nothing, because the modal consequence
didn't even get it.
Yeah, of going on the academic job market is that you don't get a job. That is the overwhelming.
Sold your soul, and you didn't even get a.
Yeah, so I kind of
get a good time along the way.
Yep. So I resolved myself kind of early that I was going to try to be the kind of scholar that I wanted to be, and if that was inconsistent with staying in academia, well, then I would just find something else to do with my life.
No, that's it, isn't it? You go hard, and if it blows up, then so be it.
But at least you produce the kind of work that you think is valuable and important, and you can look at yourself in the mirror at the end of the day and say, I did the thing that I was trying to do.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Maybe just another few minutes, couple more questions. I mean, a lot of what you write about and what you talk about, it's it's very much kind of class focused. It's like, okay, forget the noise of the identity stuff. I did want to know what your thoughts were about the free market and capitalism, where you think whether your position is okay, it's a flawed system, but it's the best we've got, we should tweak it, versus we really do need a totally different system. I did want to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, so I would be open to the argument that I'm most persuaded by with respect to capitalism per se are arguments by, like, Hayek has this book called, well, I forget what the actual book is called, but the subtitle is The Mirage of Social Justice. And what he argues is that people often misunderstand markets, especially Republicans and conservatives and so on, really misunderstand markets. What markets don't do, what they've never done, what they'll never do, is make sure that the people who are the hardest working earn the most money, that the people who are the most deserving, the most moral, the most honest, the most innovative earn the most money. Markets don't work that way. They never have, they never will. There are plenty of people who work really hard who don't end up at the very top of the distribution, and sometimes who end up at the bottom. There are plenty of really innovative people who just, the stars don't line up right for them for their innovation to matter. Yeah. And other people who are like less innovative, who end up making a big impact for lesser, despite being less innovative, because the stars lined up right. They had all these advantages. Markets don't prevent any of that. In fact, that's kind of the norm in markets. He said the reason why markets are good is that they help solve coordination problems and information problems. And so you often don't see the same kind of catastrophic things at the bottom, because a lot of, when you're trying to manage really complex dynamic systems, the levels of information you need in order to do that effectively are immense. And it's really tough.
You can't have central control. You need the brain, the dispersed brain.
And we saw this. We saw this in the Iraq. The Iraq. And in fact, I'll just keep sticking with Republican examples, because why not? We saw this mentality at work when the George W. Bush administration, after 9/11, thought that they were going to just kind of terraform Iraq and Afghanistan from being kind of tribal societies in the case of Afghanistan, and a kind of authoritarian Arab state in the case of Iraq, into being modern secular liberal democracies or something like this. And
like they somehow sort of did with Japan after the Second World War, something like that.
Well, and there was a bunch of problems with this approach, but not the least, even for things like city planning. The Bush administration fired in Iraq, for instance, they fired anyone who was affiliated with the Ba'ath Party, even though a lot of the people who were affiliated with the Ba'ath Party were just because you had to be part of the Ba'ath Party. Like they weren't ideologues. They were just,
It's like joining the CCP.
Yeah.
You just got to do it to get ahead.
Absolutely. And so they fired all of those people. And then they brought in a bunch of people from Stanford and places like that who were going to redesign their traffic systems from the ground up, redesign all of these systems and institutions. So a bunch of nerds who had never done anything in the world were going to kind of rebuild these organic systems that had built up over time that people were very used to, that worked imperfectly, but well enough for people to function and get by. They were going to redo all of that. And it was a total disaster. Not just the democracy war part was a disaster, but even the kind of basic logistical stuff that they were trying to do about like reworking how cities work, how traffic works, how all this stuff.
So the Republicans were guilty of centralized planning.
Yeah.
They tried to be commies.
They tried. There's a great book on this called Black Mass by John Gray, where he explicitly draws this analysis of how a lot of the folks in the Bush II administration really embraced mindsets that were kind of pretty common actually among the left people that Republicans had typically criticized before 9/11. And you could even see a transformation in some of the people involved, like Rumsfeld. Before 9/11, because he kind of was shaped after Vietnam, he was really opposed to major U.S. Unnecessary interventions to try to terraform systems, to remake states into completely different kind of governments, because that's what we were trying to do in Vietnam, right? He was against that. After 9/11, though, it seems like 9/11 just really shook up a lot of these people and just totally changed their thinking about a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But so you can even, so all to say, this isn't a mindset that is only found on the left. You sometimes see it on the right as well. But yeah, so this is what markets and an appreciation for markets can sometimes help you avoid is getting around these information and coordination problems, kind of respecting these systems that have emerged over time, their emergent properties, being sensitive to to some of the risks that are involved in inventions into fluid and complex systems.
Yeah, you don't actually have to know the whole system. You trust to, the dispersed brain or whatever to solve problems.
Yeah, and so I think if there's a way that that you could take some of those benefits of the existing system and merge them with. So what some folks like to stick with the example of Hayek and some other folks like Nozick in the libertarian tradition, I guess, argued for is the existence of a UBI, a universal basic income, because he said precisely because the market doesn't solve all of these problems, it doesn't and never will make sure that everyone in society has a decent standard of living on its own. That everyone in society has a decent amount of opportunity and so on. That Hayek argued that what might be useful would be to have some kind of universal basic income then to make sure that so that the floor of society is at a decent level where people can live a decent standard of life. And this would actually be good, he argued, for even increasing dynamism in the market, because people would be more comfortable taking risks. Like if you're stuck at a crappy job that you don't want to quit because you need healthcare, and so you're doing
it's going to be far less innovative.
Yeah, you're going to be far less innovative. You're going to be far less committed. You're going to be far less everything. Compared to if you can quit that job and find something better that you're kind of passionate about and that you're interested in, and feel the freedom to do that. Because if you quit your job, you're not going to be homeless, or you're not going to be without healthcare, and you're not going to be right. So there are ways that you can provide some of these basic social benefits that actually can enhance some of the benefits, some of the upsides of markets while minimizing some of the downsides. But the problem, Hayek said, is when you get too into the weeds, and so this is why he just favored a universal basic income, like some of these kind of basic universalistic policies instead of what we do now,
which is trying to finesse it.
Yeah, trying to here's how much you need for food, here's how much you need for rent. We're going to give you this much for food, but you can only use it on these types of food and under these types of stores, and
it's
we're going to give you this much for rent.
Humiliating as well.
Yeah, it sends a message that we don't trust ordinary people, especially poor people, to make decisions on their own. That they need people like us to tell them what to do and how to live, because otherwise they're going to make shitty decisions because they're terrible people. And and so there's a lot of things like that that are like that that are on their face social justice oriented and egalitarian, but also show a kind of contempt for the very people that and a mistrust of the very people that we're supposed to be representing and helping. And so, a way to get around that would just be to do something like a UBI. And there is a lot of evidence in the Global South, for instance, that just giving people money, direct transfers of wealth, actually works better than a lot of these other programs at fostering social mobility over a long period, like at actually helping people escape poverty in a durable way, compared to some of the existing programs that are where you have like an NGO or a government that decides, here's what I'm going to do to help you, and here's what you need, and here's what you should want if you don't do that, if you just give people money.
Is that the microfinance thing?
So microfinancing...
I mean, that's obviously, you have to pay it back, I guess.
Yeah. So microfinancing has some potentials, but some down. But also they have platforms like Give Directly, and they have pilot programs for UBI that they're doing in some towns and stuff in the Global South. They show that they perform at least as well and often better than the existing programs, with a lot less cost and overhead, because you don't need all these administrators and so on to monitor these programs. You just give people money, and
Yeah, sure. Look, let's finish up there. That's tremendous.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know, any final thoughts or anything?
No, this is great. A lot of fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.